Hello, everyone. This is episode 7 of Indie2Indie, and we are continuing the series by covering developers in the Shorter Games with Horse graphics bundle. And today I am joined by.
Hello, I'm Gawain, the designer of Drake.
Great. Um, so I noticed you have a few different games and a couple assets on your itch.io page. Exactly how long have you been making games?
um, I've actually been at it since I was about 12, so that puts me at about 22 years.
Okay, it's a significant amount of time then.
Yeah,
Um, so Okay, so if you've been making them since you were 12, are we talking like actual video games, or is it more like
it
writing
was
down stuff or
it was pretty much my childhood hobby,
hmm
and then it kind of just kept growing and took over everything else and became like the one thing that I always want to do.
hmm
Uh,
Cool. Um, so how exactly did you get into making games then? Like what was the catalyst behind that?
Um, my dad worked back then. He worked for a software distributor.
hmm
So he always ended up with like weird things, and we had like a Mac and like various old computers line. They're old now, but at the time they were like the newest thing.
Right.
Um, so he ended up with a collection, and then as kids we just got to play them,
hmm
and we had no idea where they were from or what what they did. But we started off this back on like MS DOS. We basically started there, um, and I played them, and it was enjoyable to play them, but I found myself more interested in like how they did the stuff.
hmm
Like when I played a platformer, I was more interested in like, oh, this is a new concept, like putting the bad guys this way and having the character attack work like this instead of like A instead of like B.
hmm
And then I found a classic shareware game called Jetpack, which came with an editor.
hmm
And that became basically my afternoons, just creating random levels for me and my brother to play.
hmm
We made spectacularly terrible ones, and just we had a blast doing it because you could put things together, and then it was like your world. It was the one screen that's just a jet level for Jetpack, but it was our level.
hmm
And that especially for me, that really hooked me into the whole thing.
hmm
Another software on that computer was a quick basic compiler. And so I started tinkering around with it, learning it basically the hard way from the manual and myself just poking it for hours,
hmm
until stuff started coming out. I figured out, some basics, how to draw graphics, figured out some basic interactivity. Most of the time, my games had no way to quit, so if you ran it, like that was what the computer did until you shut the whole machine down because there was just no exit.
hmm
Um, but it gave me a lot of playing around with the like kind of the underlying concept that this digital machine can create interactive experiences.
Right.
And then along came Windows and operating systems updated, and then along came a small game called Myst, by Cyan.
hmm
And that game, it was one of the first uses of CD. It was and what struck me most with it was just how much story you could tell, because Myst was just screenshots that you click through,
hmm
and there were puzzles integrated into it. There's a lot of little interactive things, but for the most part, it was like telling story through just like the level flow, the way that you go through the level, or the way that things present themselves in the game.
hmm
And that at the time I had started designing little games on my own on paper,
hmm
and that really spoke to me how this machine that just has like some pictures and some video, pre-recorded video, it could tell a whole world. And that really it sparked two things in me. One, it could actually tell the entire world and like capture the imagination of whoever was playing it. And two, everyone's playthrough of it is a little different. Like everyone's experience of Myst is different because it's them exploring that world.
Hmm.
And so this kind of personal interaction between a person and the video game became like a new way of storytelling for me, and
Hmm.
that basically got me hooked.
Gotcha. Um, so why is it that you make games? Is it for that sort of interaction and storytelling, or something else?
I think it's mainly the interaction for storytelling, and then one of the other things is I love taking a concept and seeing how it would be as a game,
Hmm.
which is it's a little weird for like non-designers to get their head around, but you can think of it as like how brands will decide like this is our product is a soda, and this is how that soda is on TV or
Hmm.
on radio or on it's like a branding. And I love how you can capture an idea or a feeling or mood and translate it into a playable interactive level. And then because it's interactable, the because you interact with it, the player becomes one of the inputs, and you can't design for that one.
Hmm.
The player is going to play it however they want. They might get stuck somewhere, and that room that you meant for it to be just like a small one offbeat path becomes like the whole game experience for them.
Hmm.
And so you have to, as I find it really interesting as the designer to have to design for that and like really focus on interactive storytelling and how is this player going to experience the game,
Hmm.
and making sure we can't catch everything, but for the most part we can catch most of those and make something interesting come out and leave that player with an experience that they'll remember.
Hmm. Cool. So, do you consider this a job, or is this more of a hobby for you?
When it started out, it was very much a hobby. um, I've tried several times over my life to do the traditional route of making it a job,
Hmm.
going to school and trying to find a career path. And for various reasons along the way, it hasn't worked out.
Hmm.
Um, and so in the meantime, I just kept at it because for me it was more like my art.
Hmm.
So it's similar to how like an artist has to draw, or they'll just they lose part of themselves if they don't draw.
Right.
For me, making interactive video games is that for me.
Hmm.
It's my art. Um, Currently, I approach it a bit more like a job in order to, because I found if I approach it that way, it does two things. It keeps me within scope,
Hmm.
so my game can't just keep growing and growing until I can't afford to make it as one person.
Right.
And then the other thing is it keeps me in focus that somebody very random is going to play this, which is important because if you make a game for just like your brothers and sisters, they get used to all the interface quirks. They get used to the fact you're like the press start, for example. They
Hmm.
get used to the fact that's really weird and you put it on a weird key, and they skip that. But by keeping in mind that I'm going to sell this to random stranger, I can keep in mind that when interacting with this, somebody random is going to explore this,
Hmm.
and what do they get out of it? And I found that really helps me focus on basically making better design.
Hmm. Cool. Um, so let's actually talk a bit about the big game that you have in the bundle, Drake. How many people were on the team for that?
Officially, it was a solo project. It was just me.
Hmm.
I have to give credit to Mark Sparling for the music
Hmm.
because I think without the music, it would be half of what it is really.
Hmm.
Um, And I also have to thank my family, and especially my brothers Freddie and Gareth, who basically tested every version of it down to the most miserable version
Mm-hmm.
and honestly told me, hey, this level needs work, or this one's okay, or hey, that worked. This flow worked. They're the main reason why I feel the flow of the game actually works,
Mm-hmm.
despite all the small resolution and the low visibility the player has.
Mm-hmm. Um, what engine did you use to make Drake?
Um, the engine I used is called Clickteam Fusion.
Mm-hmm.
I mainly used it because originally Drake was for a game jam,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed to be familiar with the engine in order to make the deadline.
Right.
When I first scoped out the plan for Drake and what each level contained, it became really clear that I need an engine that I'm not going to be battling, that
Mm-hmm.
I know inside and out. And from my history of making games as a hobby, I was basically one of the first users of a program by Clickteam called the Games Factory
Mm-hmm.
back when it was released, and they had just upgraded from another software called Click and Play, and it let users that didn't know code basically click around a bunch and create a 2D game of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And Clickteam Fusion is basically the product of it. And over the years, I've basically learned all the kinks, all the ways to crash it, all the ways to do things cheaply and easily and faster
Mm-hmm.
over making more and more projects in it. So that's what I eventually used.
Mm-hmm. Um, really quick, is your mic on a stable surface? Because it sometimes dips, and it went a little bit quiet at the end there.
It's on the monitor,
There
which
we
is
go. Oh,
it's on a stable surface.
okay. Hmm. Okay. Um, yeah, because the volume of it just keeps kind of adjusting
Yeah, there
oddly.
might be there might be some filtering or something
Mm-hmm.
on.
Okay. Well, we can continue. Um, so why did you make this game? Was it just for the game jam? But I mean, why this game about a dragon protagonist?
Um, the first thing was that one, there was the game jam. That was like my motivation for making a project in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other thing is I had just come off some professional work, um, and I didn't really like the way that project was going. It's still under non-disclosure because it hasn't been released. But the short version was I wanted to go back to something simple like a platformer, and I knew with the 64 pixel gem, retro stuff works the best
Mm-hmm.
in that environment. And one of the other things I wanted to do was see, well, what would happen if you took that, but then you had the modern limit of pixels and stuff. Like you didn't, like you were designing for something like the Atari, but you didn't have the graphic limit anymore. What would come out if you had that low of pixels, but you could go for things that were like the Super NES or the Game Boy Advance sprites that are all bigger and more colorful, more animated. Animation frames isn't really too much of an issue anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That all that kind of scope. Um, and so I just day one of the jam because I like just crashing into the jam instead of planning ahead.
Right.
Um, Day one of the jam, I basically started sketching out like heroes and stuff, and the idea of a dragon kind of stuck around. And I just kept thinking, wouldn't it be great if there was like a game where you play as a dragon, which is like traditionally used as the evil boss or the evil bad guy in these retro things. And what if
Mm-hmm.
he was the good guy? What if this is who you root for in the video game?
Right. Hmm. Okay, cool. Um, so why did you go for this aesthetic? I assume it was mostly, for the jam that you went for 64 by 64. Um, but why this particular color palette? Um, that sort of thing.
The color palette was mainly I hadn't really done a game that was limited down to 64 pixels before.
Mm-hmm.
My previous work, I had always given myself, 128 at most, at the lowest.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sticking with like 256 colors and just, you know, using whatever, okay, I need another shade of green, another whatever. And as I was looking up old systems, I found that four colors was like tended to be the really old limit because of just the 8-bit nature of the system. It was like four colors or eight colors. That's all the system can handle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to go for a four color theme. I originally started out with Game Boy colors.
Right.
And I found it hard to separate the characters from the background with how complicated I wanted to make the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I eventually settled on blue, black, red, and yellow
Mm-hmm.
in order to just. And once I had that, I kind of just stuck with it. I was like, okay, this is all the system. Let's pretend this is all the system has. It's just these four colors,
Mm-hmm.
and that really helped home the amount of work that every sprite and every part of the level would do. Because with that, I basically ended up limited to a lot of the sprites are like one or two colors because there's just simply no way to draw anything else
Right.
where it has to go in the level or it has to overlap something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's working with such a limited color palette is tricky. Um, because there really are it's hard to add detail. It's hard to make things seem a bit more individualistic. Um, there's definitely an art to it. Um,
Yeah,
mhm.
yeah. And one one thing I just did from a design standpoint is it was almost an accident at first. I had drawn up the first two bad guys you'd run into. It's like this pirate guy, and then there's this like bat guy introduced shortly later,
Right.
and both of them had come out red. And it occurred to me that I should just complete that pattern. So if you play the game, every bad guy is red.
Hmm.
There's never any yellow bad guy or black bad guy or anything like that. They can have those colors on them, but their primary color is always red.
Hmm.
To kind of give it ends up creating a language for the player. I think the exception is like cannonballs, and there's a few exceptions in there, cannonballs, and I think um, no, I think even the bullets flash red. So I think even there. Basically, that became my code word to the player for, okay, this is safe to stand on, this is safe to touch, this part's not.
Right. Cool. About how long did it take to make this game? The jam version and the full version.
The jam version took me almost the entire, I think it was like a 3 week jam, and it took me almost the entire 3 weeks
Right.
to create the jam version. And the jam version was only the first level.
Hmm.
Because what I found out after I had this ambitious plan for plot,
Hmm.
and there were a couple things that I didn't take into account when starting it. One is in 64 pixels, you can't fit text.
Hmm.
There's almost no text on the screen if you want it readable, unless you want the player to just like have to sit there and keep scrolling through the text. And so I had to keep cutting down the dialogue, and it became really obvious that just editing down the text alone was going to eat most of the jam time.
Hmm.
So I cut it down and just went, okay, for the jam, just the first level. Let's just introduce the plot, and it ends on a cliffhanger, but it's a jam. That's all right.
Hmm.
They've got some gameplay, and there's a bit of it. And this actually helped because one of the other things you need to do in the first level is introduce all the mechanics you will later build on. And so by having only that and knowing that the jam people are only going to play that level, those 3 weeks basically became, let's get all these mechanics in. Let's we have to teach them everything, and that actually became a very good base for the tutorial. In the finished game, that level is almost entirely unmodded. Like I
Gotcha.
didn't have to touch it afterward.
Hmm. That's always a
Um,
nice feeling to get it right on
actual,
pretty much the first try.
yeah, yeah. The actual game, after the jam, I kind of burnt out a little bit just because it was one of those jams where I uploaded like right on the end of the dot. Here you go. Hopefully, please don't crash.
Hmm.
And I just needed to take a break. And then over the actual time period is about a year, but I'd say about half of that year was actually spent on the project because I gave myself breaks, or I'd make a few levels and then just, take a week or two off because I'm like, okay, how do I compress the next part of the plot down into a level? Because a lot of Drake's story is told through what's in the level, as opposed there's an intro and an outro, and I purposely limited myself to that because I didn't want to break the flow of the level. They're so short anyway
Hmm.
that I didn't want to halfway through a level, oh, here's a dump of dialogue, and here's some more stuff. So everything in the level had to graphically express the plot.
Hmm.
And, given my limitation of graphics, that took a lot of thinking. And so every now and then I would just like take a break and just get back to it later.
Hmm.
Or something would dawn on me, or I'd play a lot of it was like go play some games. And then it dawned on me, hey, this actually could also be used to express what is in my plot.
Hmm.
And I'd come back and implement that. So it was definitely a slow burn, but the whole game probably took me about half a year.
Right. Okay. Um, do, what do you think you learned from making this game? Whether it was about game design, about, yourself and your methods.
I think I learned two major things. One is don't try to make a big longer game in 64 by 64,
Hmm.
especially with 4 colors. Um, it's Drake looks really cool and unique as a result of that. It also limited how I could flow the stages and what I could do with the gameplay a lot. There was a lot of prototype gameplay I had on paper that when I set up in there, it was just like, well, the camera just doesn't help you understand what's happening because he's so big and the area around him is so small.
Hmm.
And definitely, even if you're making a retro game, give enough space around the player so they actually can see what's going on.
Right.
It sounds really basic, but I found out very quickly that that becomes a problem
Hmm.
in this low of res. Um, when I went to play other people's game jams, Drake is like twice as big as every other character that is in the jam games,
Hmm.
and there's a good reason for that because the other games you can actually see, and
Yeah.
this one, the camera was like the hardest challenge. Even though I think in the final game I've done a good job of both steering it around and locking it into rooms and helping the player understand where to go next. Um, but it was easily a big time sink was that.
Hmm.
Um, the thing, Another thing I learned is mostly about myself. The original design of Drake was a lot darker.
Hmm.
Originally, instead of him just coming down as a spirit, statue wakes up and he goes and saves everyone. Originally, that would cost, in my original plot, that cost the invaders a life, like a sacrifice.
Hmm.
So it was like going to be like, okay, last ditch effort. They couldn't defend themselves. And there was this whole darker side to the plot. And when I was making the game, there was this disconnect between what I wanted to tell and what the game was being. And around level 3 or 4, I basically decided, I realized that that wasn't the story I wanted to tell.
Hmm.
I wanted to tell something that was about hope and um, about faith and hope fighting against evil instead of and like winning instead of it costing people stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up having to revamp a lot of the plot. And I think I'm ultimately a lot happier with with the resulting world now.
Mm-hmm.
It feels more like a world that's from me as opposed to a world that was just created to let Drake have all these move sets.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a world that I'm proud of and that I want to expand and want I feel like writing more of,
Mm-hmm.
which was in the end I think the game is a lot stronger as a result of that.
Gotcha.
The main thing I learned there is you can have this because the original game would have been great. It wouldn't have been my game, and I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
If you're working on a game, the I find having an audience is great, and honestly, it's the only way the game makes any money at all.
Mm-hmm.
But the primary audience is always yourself because you're the one that spends the most time with it.
Right. Would you say that you're happy with the game? That it was worth the time, effort, etc. that you put into it?
Yeah, yeah. I'm overall quite happy with how it turned out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I have a little bit of regret with the game engine and with I'm bumping up against some of the limitations, bringing it to other platforms now with the engine that I picked and the way I coded it, especially because it was originally game jam code under the hood, and that kind of has come back to bite me as I transfer it to other platforms and make update it for modern systems.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding I have to a lot of that update. The end result looks like I just basically ported it, but the under the hood is I almost had to rewrite the whole game. So
Mm-hmm.
that's been one of the constant struggles. Um, but overall, I'm quite happy with how it turned out. It's one of my best games, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Um, I want to move into more general questions about your game development. How would you describe the games that you make? Is there a general theme, or do you just kind of go for whatever you find inspiring at that moment?
Um, that's that's interesting. When I first started out, I was mostly cloning what I saw out there
Mm-hmm.
because I would like see something out there and then I would be like, oh, I wonder how that works. And I'd like theorize, okay, how would I make that?
Mm-hmm.
End up cloning, cloning a big existing game or a big mechanic. Like I'd see an example is like I'd see how Donkey Kong had the on rails levels where you
Mm-hmm.
just jump. And so I'd be like, okay, how would I actually go about making that in my game engine?
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I've kind of found myself and I figured out which things don't work and which things work better, but also which things don't work for me and which things are like really me.
Mm-hmm.
A big general theme right now is mostly cute dragons or cute mythical monsters.
Mm-hmm.
Like taking something that traditionally is scary and like evil. And well, what if there was like this cute version of it
Right.
that you could relate to? You know, what if you could relate to it, and what does its world look like? You know, from its perspective, what kind of game does that end up creating if you're playing as that thing?
Mm-hmm.
You know, or playing with that thing. That's been my biggest theme lately, and I found, especially through making Drake and the what I did with the plot there, I basically found that my brand, despite my brand, even though I like feel like writing a lot of dark things, when it finally gets made, it ends up bright. It ends up somehow warming people's hearts
Mm-hmm.
because and I think that is a good part of me that shouldn't ever go away, and it's also it comes through all my work.
Hmm. Great. Um, do you have a favorite game that you've made?
My I have kind of a cheat here because my favorite game is always whatever I last made.
Hmm.
I have a feeling and general belief that if a game if you're not happy with a game, you just shouldn't be making it. So almost every game I made is my favorite. The latest one that I happen to have made right now is Noodles, and I
Is
love.
what?
It's a game called Noodles
Hmm.
over on itch.io, and you control this little dragon going around following the mouse and try to eat little noodle bowls. And there's like bad guys coming in, and like it's just a cute little arcade game basically.
Hmm.
Um, but I found if you ask me that question, it's almost always just whatever last I made.
Hmm.
So I think every one of my games ends up being my favorite from one point to another.
Hmm. I gotcha. Um, let's say that you had infinite time, infinite resources, whether that be money, access to things, people, etc. To make a game, what game would you make?
Um, I've had a game since my childhood back on sketching little papers that has just stuck with me.
Hmm.
Um, it's this universe called that would the game would be called Happy's Adventure, and
Hmm.
it's a 3D platformer. And the core story of its universe is that these you have these little smiley guys, um, and they've they're ancient there's an ancient civilization long gone, but they found a way to capture joy into artifacts. That
Hmm.
was like their thing. Like how other ancient civilizations in fiction would like capture their power or their ability or whatever, and pass that on. What if a civilization could just pass on like all the joy they create to the next civilization? What's the effect of that? And what happens when the current civilization hasn't reached that level? There's people that are corrupt in it.
Hmm.
There's people that are filled with greed or bad ideas, or they want to collect these power and abuse it. And our hero Happy would basically go and confront all these guys.
Hmm.
And it's a 3D platformer, so you go around and knock things out. But it would be approached more like, um, you would like knock them out but not kill them,
Right.
and ultimately each boss you would find a way to redeem them.
Hmm.
And so it would be gameplay. The gameplay would be like lighthearted to get through and easy to learn, but the story would hit on some pretty hard stuff.
Hmm.
And I feel that it would give. I feel that game would give a lot of hope to the younger generation playing it, and it's kind of stuck around inside me. It's almost like I've played that game because its design keeps changing as I go through life,
Right.
and it's the ideas of that keep coming back to help me,
Hmm.
and help me through some stuff on my own. And so this game would be almost my message to our younger generation that just, hey, don't give up, keep going, and hope and faith and belief in your ideas can change the world.
Hmm.
you know and if you the two things you can do with it are use it to change the world now, and also make sure to pass it on to the future generations. Find ways, if not future generations, to the people around you right now. Find ways to pass that on and
Hmm.
pass on what you're given. And those would be like the two big themes throughout the whole platforming series of plot.
Hmm. Um, So what is it that you like about making games?
Um, I think my favorite part is taking a piece of story and figuring out, okay, this is how it is to like read or to watch. What is it like to play?
Right.
So, you take a concept like something to some event happens to a character. You go, okay, but how can we show that instead of just tell that?
Hmm.
And in particular, how does that get reflected in the level design, the what kind of world? Because in game development, you have control over the entire world around the player. Even 2D games or old old graphic games, you have control over what the how the player interacts with it, and also what happens when they interact with it.
Hmm.
What is there to explore, what is there that reacts, what doesn't react. And I find it my favorite thing about making games is finding solutions to telling even like the weirdest or most complicated plot line
Hmm.
through through like, okay, you played it and you got it, even though no oftentimes my favorite examples are ones where no words are said, and it's just like universally everyone who sees this and interacts with it like gets it, they get the main point, and they also get a little bit of themselves reflected in that
Hmm.
because they were each individual player is part of that interaction.
Right.
So I think my favorite position would have to be level design, and in particular taking story and turning it into levels or areas of the game.
Hmm. Cool. Um, is there something that you don't enjoy about making games?
Yeah, I think there's always something that's a pain.
Hmm.
Um, for me, the part I don't enjoy the most is dealing with like low level or rendering code or code that is basically code in general, I guess, is the gist of it. I
Hmm.
like high level code. I like coming up with clever code solutions, but the problem is I'm not too good at it because I have some mild dyslexia,
Hmm.
and so I'll swap variables and code around or equations around. And the problem code has is it can run when the variables are wrong, and you'll get the wrong result, but it doesn't tell you that that's why it's wrong. It doesn't tell you the logic is wrong
Right.
because
It'll
it's
still work regardless of
works.
how you have written the code, um,
Yeah.
until it super fails.
Yes. Yes. And so that part frustrates me a lot. I think it's the main reason why I got hooked onto tools like Clickteam Fusion, and I've since kind of, especially when I was pursuing this as a job, I kind of overcame that hurdle through a lot of painful learning. For
Hmm.
me, it was painful. For people that grasp code, it's probably not as painful. But for me, like even following tutorials and things was just it was nightmarish at times because I'd follow it and do all the steps, and then my code doesn't work like their code, and I don't know why because
Hmm.
somewhere along the way my dyslexia swapped something. Uh, and so that is probably the least fun thing. But
Hmm.
what's driven me to do it anyway is all the other pieces that allows.
Hmm.
So even though I hate code, I end up using. Recently, I've used a lot of Unity because even though I have to code everything to get the engine to work, having that baseline engine actually work out of the box is
Hmm.
really helpful. Um, and it almost lets me skip the low level part of like, okay, how's a graphic show up on the screen, lets me skip all that, to me, boring work. I know for other people it's really exciting to find new things, and as a more high level designer, I
Hmm.
really appreciate all the breakthroughs that oh, hey, now we can have like 100 of these instead of 10 and
Hmm.
stuff like that. It's really empowering. But for me personally, that part is a nightmare.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very difficult when you have to do the coding and try and go it on your own, so to speak. And then you know go hunting down through forums and oh, this person apparently figured out the solution, but they didn't leave the answer. They were just like, oh, I figured it out, close the thread. It's like, no, leave it for the next generation,
Yes,
please.
yes.
Um,
I in hindsight, I wonder how much of my pass it on is
mhm,
because I've run into that
mhm,
most of the time while I learn. It's like, oh, well, but you didn't tell me what the solution was.
right, yeah. Um, I remember because I would make games in RPG Maker, there was a fix. I I am not good at code, but I'm very good at reading code. So I can eventually sit there and puzzle out what the problem is, even though I have no actual code education. I'm just very good at math and problem solving, so I can make my way eventually. I just have to hit my head against a brick wall for a while. But there was a lifesteal script that was supposed to work with a negative version, so that way you know it's like a curse effect. You know, you deal damage, you take a portion back. It wasn't working. And I looked through the script, I'm like, oh, it's because this formula is set to this, so it can't work. And then I tried it again and I realized, oh, okay, I need to make it a non-zero number, not just if it's any number. So I had to sit there and puzzle through that a bit. And then I posted it on Reddit somewhere in like the RPG Maker subreddit or whatever, just so that way in case, and I also screen capped it, so just in case I ever have that problem again, I'm like, I can search my picture file or I can search on the internet and have it pop up, because I know that I will forget how I solved that and I would rather
Yeah.
have it happen quickly the next time.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. All the time.
yeah, so that's my personal favor for that, is simply because you will have the same problem again. I have a good memory, but nobody has a perfect memory for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and it's also just, even if you do, it's helpful for everybody else that's going to run into it. Um, so, do you think that there's anything in games that you think we'll have to all incorporate at some point? You know, games industry at large at this with this question. Do you think we're all going to have like voice acting in our games, or you know, VR, multiplayer, any of that?
I think one of the biggest ones currently is VR.
Hmm.
Um, VR allows a lot of immersive storytelling, but it also requires a lot of careful design. It
Hmm.
doesn't work to just take regular games and make them VR games without a lot of extra work. You're essentially doubling the workload of the game. And as VR headsets become cheaper and as people become more widespread, more open to it, more
Hmm.
and more gamers are going to want to hop on board and try it. And it's to the point now where right now there's like a split. There's almost two markets. And I'd really love to see the big game engines solve that and like start bringing it out so that VR ends up being something that just like works along with these other interactables or these other engine mechanics. There's like a way to make a VR version, just like how there's a way to make an HTML5 version or a Switch version.
Hmm.
I'd love to see the platforms take that on. I feel a few years at least away from that day,
Hmm.
but I think it is coming. And one of the big things is that all the storytellers and the designers are going to have to figure out how to speak in that language versus how to speak in the 2D screen world,
Hmm.
because it's different enough where you can't, like, some things translate, but you can't just one use the same design.
Right.
um So I think that's coming. But ultimately, I look at the history of games. Our platforms have always been changing,
Mm-hmm.
and they've been evolving and becoming better in some ways and worse in other ways. I think anybody who codes can agree there. There's always something that you're like, why doesn't the new platform do this? It was so useful on the old system, or the old, the old way of doing this. And there's the one thing that doesn't change is that we are designing a video game. It's an experience for one or more players who want to play around with a technological device and be transported. The imagination wants to be transported into a world or a activity.
Mm-hmm.
And in that regard, I feel that no matter how the devices change, we're going to be making games for something.
Mm-hmm.
And the more important idea is to be able to take an idea and convert it into a game for the current generation, whatever that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel if the industry focuses on that, especially the designer side, if they focus on that and realize that like that it doesn't so much matter what you're designing for, what matters is that what you're designing is a video game for,
Mm-hmm.
it's a concept that players can enjoy and interact with.
Mm-hmm. All right. Is there something that you think indie games and studios are able to do that outperforms AAA games and studios?
It's really hard to outperform AAA studios in
Mm-hmm.
a lot of ways. There's certain problems that manpower can solve that just as an indie you're like, well, we can't do it. The strength of indies, I believe, is in shooting for oddball ideas.
Mm-hmm.
We can do weird stuff because we don't have hundreds of people's personal income riding on whatever we go for,
Mm-hmm.
and we have smaller teams, so we can more focus on what each individual team's member actually wants to work on. What is their heart, what drives their heart to make video games?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the strength of small indie studios or even small individual people making video games. That if nothing else, that is your biggest weapon, is
Mm-hmm.
that you can shoot for an oddball crazy idea. What if platformer but has this really bad idea,
Mm-hmm.
and you can sit down and do it instead of being stuck trying to pitch that to a publisher or an investor, and having them go, well, no, that's not how those work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think over the course of video game history, it's always been an indie almost all the time that first has that spark of like, hey, let's do what if this happened? What if a game did this instead?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that happens when you have one person working on their spark.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something triple A's, I think, almost becomes their weakness, because they have so many people working on it, and like, you hand ideas off to the art department, and the art department puts their heart and soul into it, but it's not made by one individual. Or if it is, there's a bunch of censorship going on all the other team members as a result.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel the best games seem to come from studios where everybody was given a voice and everyone could input their work into it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Having said all that, being by yourself working on a project or being in a small team working on a project can also be one of our biggest weaknesses, because we love shooting for triple A ideas.
Mm-hmm.
We love shooting for things that are so far out of scope that it's hopeless. It's going to take us like 10 years to get this game done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so it's kind of a double edge. It's like we're able to be more flexible, but we also are unable to be reminded from other people that, hey, by the way, that idea, it's going to take too long.
hmm I remember it was the first or second GDC that I went to, and if this person's watching this, I'm sorry, I apologize, I guess. There was a there was like an after party sort of thing at a place a little ways away, so I walked in and there were some people that were at tables showing off their stuff. And so, I commented on some of them, I talked shop with a few. And this guy was talking about this VR game where it was going to have like it was going to be an educational game, but it was going to have like all this ability to do vocabulary and stuff. It was like Scribble Knots on steroids in VR. Now, Scribble Knots in VR, it's an interesting sounding concept. The workload behind that would be enormous. Um, he had a team of 20 people and they were expecting to have it done in, I forget, like 2 years maybe? I feel like it was like shorter than that, but I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say 2 years. It was still like just a ridiculous time. I looked at him and I looked him in the eyes and I said, no. And he said, what? I'm like, oh, nobody's told you yet. Oh, how many games have you shipped? And he's like, well, we haven't shipped any yet. And I'm like, okay, let me tell you how it's actually going to go down because somebody needs to give you like some amount of information here. And I had a very uncomfortable talk with this person, and they uh, blew me off by the end of it. So I hope things went well for them, because I will say in part, if you're going to try and shoot that hard, you need that level of confidence, but I haven't seen anything that looks remotely like that game, and it's been 5 years now, so, but yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's very difficult to have an idea and want to pursue it so hard, and it's very difficult to listen to people try and talk you down from that ledge. Um, yeah.
yeah, it's definitely our greatest strength and also our biggest weakness
hmm
is just shooting for an oddball idea.
hmm
Because when we see one, we get stuck on it,
hmm
and it's the oftentimes there's nobody there saying, hey, actually that's just going to be a waste of time. You could make like four or five other of your ideas in that
hmm
time. Um, Probably my best advice to avoid that is to have multiple ideas.
hmm
Just keep, you've got the one that you want to do today, but have a few others for tomorrow.
hmm
And every now and then, take a look at that list and seriously question, okay, which one of these is the smallest, easiest one to do? Which one's the heaviest? And how long do I want before I release something? Um, that's that's really helped me, um, because one of my big one of my big projects is this 3D platformer that is telling a story way out of my scope. It's something that the story, level design, modeling, bad guy animation for it, everything is just way bigger than one person can do. And that's basically how I am able to work on other games,
hmm
because if if I was just following this is the one big idea, I would still be stuck back there, still working on all of those. And none of Drake and Noodles and all these great other things wouldn't exist
hmm
because they'd be down that list and I wouldn't have gotten to them.
Um, do you have any advice for people who want to get into making games?
Um, the best advice I can say is shoot for smaller, manageable ideas.
hmm Yeah, I have to agree on that point. Because these days, when when I want to make a game, especially just because the first game I ever made that certainly went. That was a game. Um, it what I Nowadays, if I want to make a game, I usually put out a prototype that I work anywhere from a week to a month on. Usually, I'll start prototyping, and if I'm still like interested in it after 2 days, I'm like, okay, well, this is actually worth exploring. Because oftentimes I'll like start exploring the idea, and I'm like, this is garbage. I can't execute it, and nobody should, and I will just throw it away. Um, but
Yeah.
if I feel like it after, 2 or 3 days maybe, I'm like, okay, I'll actually spend time on this. And so I'll get out a simple enough prototype and I'll post it up and I'll see how people react. If I actually start getting like comments and feedback, I'm like, oh, okay, so people are paying attention and are actually, giving me feedback, which is more than I can say for some of my other prototypes and whatnot. So this is actually worth some amount of my time. Um, and then there's also the marketing aspect because I do have to look at like, okay, what can I actually make into a GIF that works well and stuff like that. Because I'm trying to do this full time, and so marketing for me is extremely important because that's how I get groceries and get to eat every week. Um, so yeah, it's definitely important to prototype because, worst case scenario, people don't like it and you've only blown that much time on it as opposed to, a longer form thing that you find out at the very end, oh, nobody actually wants this. Um,
Yeah.
mhm,
Yeah. Prototyping is another really big one.
mhm,
Just prototype fast. Capture when you prototype. Ignore the bigger picture.
mhm,
Focus on, okay, this is the gameplay or this is the key thing that I want to happen.
mhm,
Make that and find out how fun it is.
right.
Because otherwise, you could sit there designing the world and characters and everything, and then the main game just isn't fun. So now you've wasted all that extra time designing.
Mhm. Um, okay, well, that covers our game questions, and now I have a little ending survey to try and get to know you a little bit better, so people can know
Yeah,
the person behind the developer. Um, what would you say is your favorite virtue?
honesty. Of everything I found, honesty ends up being the most important.
Hmm. What would you say is the principal aspect of your personality?
Um, openness, openness for sure. Just the I've back when I was younger, I kept images up, and I
Hmm.
kept depending on who I was with, I would not be myself, and I would be the professional in here, or I would be the grocery person over here, or whatever.
Hmm.
As and as time went on, I found that clashed very much with my favorite virtue, the honesty. Um, and I find it a lot more helpful to be open.
Hmm.
And I think being open actually comes across to others as being a lot stronger than any of those fronts that you would put up.
Hmm.
Because if you're honest and open about yourself, it means that, like, yeah, I have some embarrassing things about myself, but I'm not ashamed of them.
Hmm.
They're part of me just like everything else. And so by being open, um, that has become almost my main personality in everything I do. Is just I constantly in my head remind myself, you know what, you're Gawain Dole. Be yourself.
Hmm. Cool. What would you say are your favorite qualities in another person?
Op- Optimism, definitely optimism.
Hmm.
You need a lot of it in this field. Because there will be times when you think you have the greatest idea in the world and you make it and it just it really isn't that great. No, nobody else really resonates with it, and it's that optimism both for it and also optimism that lets you put it aside without losing yourself in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Because optimism also lets you put that aside and realize there's always going to be another game that you work on. There's always going to be something else. Some other idea will come in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not here now, it'll happen and you'll have that spark sometime in the future. I think especially as video game designers,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of becomes our curse basically. We always have a game idea. But that being optimistic about it helps us turn that into a blessing.
Mm-hmm. Um, what would you say you appreciate the most in your friends?
Um, what I appreciate most is that my friends will take the time to understand other people's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of reacting right away to, say, a burst of anger or something, just a lot of my friends will take the time to go, okay, you've had a bad day. What happened?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that it's part of is part of what keeps relationships working is to be able to go, okay, you're acting very out of character. What happened to you? What is it from your perspective? And I think that's also that comes across in a lot of what I want to say in video games as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is that's almost the whole idea behind me taking something cute and legendary and something legendary known to be monstrous, and well, what if it's cute so you can relate to it, so you can understand it.
Mm-hmm.
What is the world like from somebody else's perspective.
Right. Um, what would you say is your main fault or flaw?
I get distracted way too easily. um I'll sit down to work on something,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll be constantly like, oh, but what about this 3D print idea I have? Or what about this crazy thing? Or what if people designed a thing for that? And as a designer, I'm constantly looking for solutions to problems.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I can't turn that off. And then it just distracts me, and I keep researching things that are completely irrelevant to what I'm working on, or sometimes too relevant as well. It works the other way too, where I'll be making a game mechanic and I'll think, well, why do those do that? You
Mm-hmm.
know, let's capture the essence of why these do that. And then I'll go down and research, and about 6 hours later, I'll finally decide, you know what, they just do that. That's all anybody else is going to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably my main fault, is that I'm easily distracted.
Mm-hmm. Um, that also I want to bring talk about that for just a brief moment. When you're developing with nobody else, really, it's really just yourself in a room trying to work on a game. It is very easy to get distracted, and it takes a lot of self-discipline to keep working on things because you have to be able to tell yourself, no, I'm not going to click on that YouTube link or whatever that's going to lead me down a rabbit hole. Oh man, I didn't know, Rammstein put out a new music video. Let me check this out. And then it just is going to go on for the rest of the day. Like, oh, let me see all this other new stuff. And yeah, it's self-discipline and keeping yourself on task is a very, very difficult thing to manage. So I would also mention the fact that I think everybody at least struggles with distractibility, especially, COVID and everything going on right now. It's almost like everybody needs a distraction, really. Um, what would you say is your favorite way to spend time?
Um, playing video games. I know that's like the easy game designer way out here,
Hmm.
but it's true. I
It's tough for me
when I
these days.
when I don't make video games, I end up playing video games or doing something related to them. So
Hmm. What's your idea of happiness?
my core idea of happiness is loving what you're doing or creating
Hmm.
and being able to share it with others. That second part, I think, is even more important than the first.
Hmm. What is your idea of misery?
Um, Being stuck doing something that you absolutely hate with
Hmm.
no one to share or express it with. Because like even if you're stuck doing some work you hate, if you have somebody to share in your misery,
Hmm.
it makes it bearable. It makes it go from something that's just overwhelming to something that you can actually work through together.
Hmm.
And I think not having anybody to share that with would be the most miserable experience. I think
Hmm.
in just within our existence as humans, I think that's the most miserable place someone can find themselves in.
Hmm. If not yourself, who would you like to be?
Um, I'm not really sure. Um, I think it would be fun to be a Gryphon, but they're not very good at using computers. So,
Hmm.
I would miss being able to type and use a computer and
So,
design
so
video
you would
games.
want to be one with human hands?
Possibly, possibly. Um, I just like Gryphons in general,
Hmm.
so that that's probably it. As far as most humans, I think they're better at being themselves than me. So if I take over, it'll be one of those disaster movies where like their brains swapped and then they turn crazy.
Hmm.
So I'm pretty happy as far as being human. I'm pretty happy being myself.
Okay. Um, where would you like to live?
My favorite places, I haven't really been out of the U.S. But in the U.S., my favorite places are Arizona and South Dakota. Places like Badlands, the Grand Canyon. Um, I love the deserts with big mesas and canyons and all that kind of all that kind of stuff with cactus and everything.
Hmm.
I love how there's still life there,
Hmm.
even though it's barren desert. And I love the way that life has just adapted to those areas. Um, I find that really inspiring. The idea that even given they're given a hot desert with barren rock, and they've found a way to thrive
Hmm.
in that environment, and I find that inspiring to just be around. And I think that would be where I eventually would move to if I had infinite money and could move wherever I want. I think that area is where I'd end up living.
Hmm. Um, what is your favorite color?
My favorite color is yellow. Um, a lot of a lot of people who meet me think that's because I like smiley faces.
Hmm.
I liked the color yellow before I was associated with smiley faces, though the two kind of coexist
Hmm.
in my brain. So I'm not actually sure which is which, but that's always been my favorite color.
Hmm. What is your favorite flower?
Um, I don't have any particular favorite flower, but I like cactus flowers
Hmm.
in general. Part of that is I like cactus in general.
Hmm.
I just find it the insanity of how much evolution needed to happen for a cactus to be a thing. Like
Hmm.
to for it to just be able to live in ridiculous places and not only live but thrive.
Hmm.
Um, and it just drives home to me the idea that sticking things out and just making the best of whatever life gave us to work with really is that's almost what life is all about right there.
Hmm. What is your favorite animal?
My favorite animal by far is tigers. I like a lot of the big cats, especially because they, even though they're huge, underneath a lot of them basically are the same as our house cat,
Hmm.
which it can be both a it can be a scary thing, but it can also be hilarious at times as the bigger ones try to do what because they think they're a small cat, even though they're given such a huge body.
Hmm. What are your favorite authors?
But I have two of them.
Hmm.
One is Douglas Adams because his work in especially the Hitchhiker's Guide series is hilarious, and just the way he can take concepts and just turn them into something funny,
Hmm.
even though the concept is based on like a lot of his jokes work because you inherently know like corporations tend to corrupt people or whatever, and
Right.
he takes that idea that everybody kind of knows, dives way further into it than he should,
Hmm.
and makes it somehow enjoyable and funny on to as for what actually happens in his story or his characters, and I love that about his writing.
Hmm.
The other writer I am a really big fan of is Jules Verne, um, and I think it's mostly because he is really good at using words to express a world.
Hmm.
Um, when you read his writing, you get all kinds of details, and if you, he's a little hard to read because some of his English is no longer in use. But if you really understand like the definitions of what it meant at the time,
Hmm.
there's a whole bunch more detail than even his already detailed paragraphs have. And he's really working with words to create a world. He's when you read his writing, you end up immersed in a fictional world,
Hmm.
and you end up being able. He gives you enough detail where not only does the story work in it, but you also like you could imagine what it's like to live there and what the rest of the world is. You can fill that out because there's just so much detail, even though his descriptions honestly aren't much longer than a lot of the other fictional books around.
Hmm.
Um, it's just masterful the way he paints worlds. And the other thing is he's inherently funny as well.
Hmm.
It's just he's a lot sneakier about it.
Right. Right.
These worlds have a lot of humor that the story when you're reading it isn't particularly funny.
Hmm.
When you go back and think on it and realize what had to happen to these characters or this universe for like that device to be built, or
Hmm.
for these characters to be here together or whatever,
Hmm.
you start to realize that he had some sneaky funny stuff in his plans,
Hmm.
and he snuck them by you when you were reading it. You didn't realize at the time, but then thinking back, it's not as in your face as Douglas Adams, but it's still there. There's this underlying punch of like, by the way, this device is actually really really funny.
Hmm. It's a very British sort of humor
Yeah,
where they kind of they put layers under it, and it's not even like it's not at all a hit you in your face thing. They're just like, yeah, this is just the way that it is, and then you think about it, it's like, wait,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
oh, okay,
Like
okay,
when you read Jules Verne, you feel like this is a coherent, real. Like he makes the world feel real.
Yes.
as you read it. And then when you come out of it and start talking about it to someone, it's really only when you start talking about it to someone else that you realize, wait, what kind of universe have I been living in?
Mm-hmm.
Because all this British humor comes out, and you're just like, wait, oh wait, that wasn't serious at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just great how like double layered everything is.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any favorite developers?
My absolute favorite developer is Cyan Worlds. They're the creator of Myst,
Mm-hmm.
and it's no exaggeration to say without Myst, I wouldn't be here telling stories in video games. Um, and then their latest games, all even post Myst, where they're making new universes, they all have this surreal feel, which I think it ends up being like how I like Jules Verne. It's when you're playing it, it's like it's surreal, it's weird.
Mm-hmm.
The scene in front of you isn't real. It's not something that could be on Earth,
Mm-hmm.
but it's feels like it belongs there. It feels like part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like a logical continuation of the story. And more importantly, they're really good at telling moody, hopeful, or tragic like story beats with oftentimes nothing actually happening. Like
Mm-hmm.
there are parts in some of their latest stuff like Abduction, there are parts of the level that tell tragic or hopeful story beats and nobody talks. Like all that happens there is you walk into that area, and because of the composition, the level design around you, and how it subtly changed from what you were in before, you end up walking through with a mood
Mm-hmm.
and an idea and oftentimes even a story beat or a concept along with it. And then as you explore that area, you find all these little details that help support or deny the theories that are going on in your head.
Mm-hmm.
And every scene you end up walking away from into the next scene with an almost concrete idea. You're like, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what's going on here in this scene now. And what I what I find fascinating is that they're really good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're masterful levels good at it. And so I've always enjoyed playing their games. And by far they're my favorite developer of all time. They've had just a huge influence on my own methods to storytelling and my own concepts of what video games are
Mm-hmm.
and what you can do with them.
Cool. Um, for my last question, do you have any special or peculiar talents?
Um, I think the probably the most peculiar one is to come up with bad ideas. And what I mean by that is I'll like come up with something it's basically the oddball idea, but it's inherently bad. It's there's no way this solves the problem. It just completely exaggerates the problem that it's setting out proposed to solve.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's definitely a peculiar talent. I'm not sure it's too useful, but one thing that it's like borderline useful for is looking at something and going, okay, what's the it's almost like looking at the problem and going, what's the worst solution?
Mm-hmm.
And then now any solution is going to solve those. Like
Right.
you made the problem so bad that now, okay, anything here is going to be an optimistic solution compared to that
Mm-hmm.
and it's often like corporate humor or something like that that drives those ideas in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that seems to generally be my talent. Um, it makes a lot of the people around me groan, and um, so it's not that great of a social talent.
Mm-hmm.
um, but I've kind of learned to laugh at it
Mm-hmm.
whenever these ideas hit, and because of my honesty, I'm always expressing them anyway, even though it, it's like, okay, well, what if you had like a device that did this? It's like blatantly that it's something that you can see a company somewhere or a design firm somewhere making all the decisions to make this, but it would be the worst product.
Mm-hmm.
It would be the worst idea.
Right.
So I think that's actually my talent is to just pick the worst idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then every now and then that actually helps me find, okay, so what's the best idea?
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's just funny.
Yeah. Um, I I mean, I don't know how many of my games you're familiar with, but I at least in terms of like my game concepts, I understand that sort of feeling where it's, oh, this is a terrible idea, and this is just gonna happen now, and nobody's going to stop
It's
me.
it's
Um,
like this is a bad idea, but I'm excited about it. Why?
right.
I want to see what the design would process would be to
Hmm.
make that.
Yeah.
Um, and it's fun. It's a way of exercising the design talents and the way of design thinking, I guess. But
Hmm.
it's also got
Yeah.
questionable application.
Hmm. Okay, well, that's all the questions I have for you. If you've got anything that you want to add on at the end here, or...
No, I think we've covered everything.
All right, great. Um, any um, social media, game links, page links, etc., anything you want to drop right now?
Um, there's there's obviously my itch.io page.
Hmm.
That's where almost everything comes out before it comes out elsewhere.
Hmm.
That's kind of my beat. If I make something, the prototype or the demo of it will be out on itch.io before anywhere else.
Hmm.
Um, so I believe I'm Gawain Dark Griffin on there. It's the page itself is a bit difficult, so hopefully you can do a YouTube link or something like
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's. I'm gonna put stuff in the description anyway. It's just it's good
Yeah,
to close out with. Okay, speaking in marketing terms here for everybody. Um, it's important to have like the call to action and stuff. Like personally, it's these are weird YouTube videos where I'm just doing interviews of people, and I I don't care if people like or subscribe or anything. Um, I just hope that this is helpful for anybody that watches. But it's still important to have that sort of call to action at the end here for if you're going to be on here doing the interview, I want people to at least know at the very end, like, oh, right, I enjoyed this and I do want to check out this person's stuff, so let me actually go and look at the links in the description and whatnot. Um,
yeah. I think the biggest one is going to be my itch page.
mhm,
Um, I'm darkgriffin.itch.io,
mhm,
and then try the next helpful one would be my Twitter handle at darkgriffin1986.
mhm,
Um, that one I post my stuff, but mostly I use it to share other people's work
mhm,
and try to broadcast out other people's ideas. And I try to keep it reasonable as far as like what I share. You know, I try to keep it. I originally tried to keep it kid friendly, but there are so many awesome ideas that aren't kid friendly
mhm,
that deserve recognition as well. So at this point, I try to steer clear of not safe for work, but besides that, I share indies looking for audience. Basically, is my whole thing there,
mhm,
and I unfortunately also fill it with griffins and other things because I like those, so they end up out there too.
mhm,
Promoting artists, and I use it to promote artists and promote bundles and cool people.
mhm. Okay, well then I think that wraps this up for us. Um, Thank you to everybody for watching all of this. This has been episode 7 of Indie2Indie. Please check out the links in the description. Please check out the bundle. And thank you all so much for watching. All right. Have a good day. Bye.